Indonesians' biggest enemy is usually ourselves. And when I say that, it's because unfortunately, when you're talking about the system, there's just so much rent-seeking behavior that happens.
Welcome to Brave. Learn from Southeast Asia's best tech leaders. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. No BS on success. I'm Jeremy Au, venture capitalist, serial founder, Harvard MBA, science fiction nerd, and dad of 2 daughters. Every week, we debate startup news, interview changemakers, answer listener questions, and share personal insights. Join our movement of over 40,000 members and get transcripts, resources, and community at www.bravesea.com. Stay well and stay brave. Hey Gita, good morning.
Morning. Hi, Jeremy. How are you?
Good. So today we wanted to talk about the Indonesian economy. So I think since the last time we chatted, I think this is the first official news that the Indonesian economy, beyond shrinking as middle class, I think there's some kind of like headwinds that are happening right now. So Gita, could you share a little bit about what's going on right now?
Well, the Indonesian economy have been going through a very rocky road. We had a crash in which the stock price went down 5%, and then IDX had to suspend trading for a while. So then I guess there were several SAP and not communication from the government's office, the president's office overall. So there was a lack of unity in the messaging and consistency in communications for both foreign and local investors, and that made the market really rocky.
What's interesting, of course, is that you're mentioning the stock market. Could you share a little bit more about what the market was reacting to?
So, for example, there was a government announcement from the Ministry of Energy that they will increase tariffs or royalty for gold and nickel by 3%. So that already increases your cost of doing business, right? And gold and nickel are two very big commodities in this country. That made a lot of industry players very wary. At the same time, there was also a wave of very public layoffs. So the biggest one is this garment company called Streetex, and they laid off, 10,000 people and they had to close. That seems to be kind of like a indication for more layoffs to come in the future, right? Because basically when you have something as iconic and as large of a company as that garment company, which is quite legendary in this country, closing off and laying off thousands of people, then the question is, okay, how is that going to hit other industry players? What about textile? And actually, what does that say about consumer purchasing power? And so that made a lot of people very wary. And that also means that our unemployment rate can keep climbing up. Then, of course, there's the Tara, the new sovereign wealth creation. When it launched, there just simply wasn't enough communication on it. So I think overall, the gist from investors, so I think several days ago, local investors and industry players went to the National Economic Council and relate the same message, which is we are not getting enough consistent and communication from the government. We don't know what policies are going to happen next. We don't know what tariffs or royalties you'll end up implementing. Basically, we are just not getting enough information to be able to predict what our next moves will be as investors. And that really was the big gist. So things just crashed left and right. And it was just a very bad movement. At the same time, in true form, with really terrible Indonesian government communication, when the stock market crashed, the communication from the president's office and from other people in the government was, oh, the stock market is not that important. We need to focus on our mission and on our programs. And so overall, people were just very, very upset. There's just a lack of communication, lack of clarity, lack of understanding where the country is going policy wise. I think that was what caused so much of this market rockiness and also just not great communications about what a crash in the stock market means, right? It is not great when the government, oh, the stock market is basically just foreign investors. They're not that important. That's really not great to hear from a country who really needs to attract foreign investment. So I think we are seeing a lot of defensiveness and also a lot of unclear communication. And that really was what all investors, be it foreign or local, were asking for. Just constant and clear communication.
I think that's really interesting here because, Indonesia is still on track for, kind of like 5% growth year on year. So I think the
Yeah.
strong demographic fundamentals are still there. And I don't think the economists have revised those
No, right.
projections.
Yeah.
It's just interesting to
Yeah.
hear that this is a kind of like set of conversation about the, domestic policies, right, of the government. Could you share a little bit more about, some of those things? Because, some of these policies are, should be stimulatory, right? So like providing free school lunches should be a
Mm,
stimulus. And,
yeah.
we previously talked about the desire to do more deficit spending, which is a net stimulus for the
Yeah.
economy. How has that panned out?
So there has been a lot of pushback about the execution of these programs, which was what we were talking about before, where I said, fundamentally speaking, do these programs make sense if you're trying to nation build? Yes. I always say execution is the key. That's the real question. Like, that's the bread and butter. Can you execute this in a way that is effective? Right? So, can you execute this in a way that is disciplined, with as little rent seeking behavior as possible, with, the most impact to the macros? Can you do all of those things? And right now, there's been so much pushback because when you're reducing spending, for example, they cut the spending from certain parts of the Department of Education in order to subsidize the free lunch program. That has gotten a lot of pushback because then, wait, are you going to focus on the nutrition, but then children won't have as many options for, free schooling? What are basically the cost benefit in these calculations, right? And so I think that's been the real problem. So, for example, they have reduced the price per meal, they have reduced the cost quite considerably since the start of the program. Now it's becoming cheaper and cheaper, which brings into question things like the quality, the freshness. There have been a lot of pushback from the recipients themselves, with many students actually demonstrating in certain parts of East Indonesia, saying that we prefer free schooling than free lunch because I guess due to the logistical issues with delivering these meals, some meals ended up being rotten. So is that the majority of the meals? No. Is it an issue enough that perhaps we should start thinking, how are these meals still being delivered? How is it working out logistically? Is this actually being delivered in the most equitable way possible? Because then the real question again becomes, okay, so if the meals are going to every single public schools, are there certain public schools that perhaps because they cater to a much higher demographic, do they quote unquote deserve these free meals? Or should we start balancing our budget in a much more equitable way so that you get the impact of what these meals can be for those most potentially affected by things like stunting? Or, do you then balance it out with free education, free educational materials, etc.? Yeah, there's been quite a lot that's been happening here.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because then the move towards like a means testing of the school program is a little bit different from a universal program. And I think generally, I
Right,
think there's some sense there, I would say, right? Because, I think that's where a challenge for all universal programs kind of fall apart. It's like,
right.
I think universal programs are supposed to make it look easier, but it ends up being more difficult in some ways. But it's interesting to see that
Yeah.
this push towards fiscal responsibility is a new push, right? Because I think previously there was a perception that the administration was going for more deficit spending, which was a recommendation. And now there's this push for a net
Yeah.
neutral, kind of like save. And in fact, it's kind of interesting because more spending on some things, but it's less spending on other things, which is a different
Right.
position. Yeah.
Right. You're absolutely right. So now there's also a lot of budget cuts in the government, which, by the way, I am not against budget cuts usually in general, because in many administrations, there can be bloated spending over time, right? So let's say you haven't really revised your spending over time. I can understand if there needs to be some efficiencies within the system. But, and this is the big but, again, it boils down to the execution and the details. What are you cutting? Does it even make sense to cut that? Right. So, for example, finding out that the Ministry of Small Medium Businesses, like their spending was cut by quite a lot, and they are responsible for millions of these micro, small, medium businesses. So, will that make sense? It's more about trying to understand the drive towards these types of efficiencies because it does have a strong trickle down effect for the rest of the economy. So, for example, by this very large deficit cut, you also affect hotels, conference centers that usually host a lot of government events, government meetings, and things like that. So that affects a lot of these local businesses. And I think that is where a lot of the pushback also comes in. Okay.
Yeah.
This is not to say that the whole hotel industry pushing back against all these government cuts. This is not to say that they all suffer equally, because recently there was also a very big scandal. And actually, until now, we still have demonstrations against it. An expedited emergency meeting to revise this very controversial bill. It is freakishly controversial. And now that I'm talking about it, yes, that's probably part of why the market also got rocky, because lack of pro-business policies that are communicated clearly and consistently. And then there's the revision for this new law, and it's basically the law for bringing back the military into their folds of, civil society and government. And if you're going to ask me what this bill is, the problem is no one really knows either, because the draft was never really circulated until now. So I don't know what to say about it, but I can only just fear the worst, because that's the problem when the government doesn't even communicate what it's trying to do. Usually the mass fears the worst.
Yeah, so lots of different news things, right? I think, one is like you said, even though the macro fundamentals are still the same, even though the economists believe that
Yeah.
growth is at 5%, like you said, there's a lot of
Yeah.
bad news that are happening in a short period of time. And maybe somebody who's
Yeah.
twitchy will look at this and say, okay, the government is not going to be stimulating economy. It's actually increasing taxes. It's actually pulling back its spending as well.
Yeah.
So this, of course, is
Yeah.
pulling money out of the system, plus
Yeah.
the various aspects about the various communications. How is infrastructure spending? Is that still pushing through? Because I know that was something that was a consensus, I would say, during the campaign, that infrastructure is good. And that's what especially the deficit spending is supposed to do. How has that panned out from your perspective? Yeah.
I mean, it really should get going, but basically the government has also spent so much time trying to centralize all the SOEs into this Danantara fund, which is the new sovereign wealth. And a lot of the infrastructure spending, I think, will only follow after that, because right now there's not even clarity on that. They keep saying we promise 8 million new jobs, we promise all these new spending, but again, that hasn't really come to light. I can't think of, one very large project that is actively being, as we speak, that is being built.
From your perspective, I'm just kind of curious, what do you think are the no-brainers for infrastructure development for Indonesia?
The no-brainers, like the ones where I think, why aren't we doing this right now?
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious, right? Because I think everybody agrees that Indonesia infrastructure could be better. So it feels like a no-brainer for everybody from a local's perspective.
Right.
What you think would be the no-brainers?
Right. So, I mean, look, I'm a very big believer in developing human resources. I'm a very, very big believer in that, because if you're going through the current playbook of, if we follow a growth pattern that is similar to, let's say, China, create manufacturing, more value added, yes, all of those are very relevant. But the problem with how fast technology is moving too is that many of these can also be automated fairly quickly. So a lot of jobs, I think, are on the line, and it's all about how do you create more educated, more informed, and flexible workforce that can withstand a lot of technological changes over time, especially with the growth of AI. and really any technology, right? So for me, the real infra is always how do we make humans better and able to reach for what they want? So rather than just saying, oh, that's like immediately education, but also we have to think about, well, do we have the necessary energy infrastructure to have that? Because right now, if you think of energy, Java, Bali really dominates the conversation, right? And then if you think about, oh, but transmission lines are very expensive, very hard to do, but you eventually will need it in every part of Indonesia. So again, it boils back to just really like the basic, like energy. And then I still really am a big believer in clean water infrastructure. We really need to solve this problem. Clean water infra will help reduce, sickness, diseases, and create a healthier human resource over time, like just cleaner, environment. You need to fix air, you need to fix the environment first so humans become healthier. Preferably you do all as quickly as possible, but then you can have education infrastructure. And not just we're talking traditional pathway to a 4-year college, but vocational schools, more specialized schools where people have a clear career path coupled with health infrastructure. So those are my big ones. So first energy, basic needs, then the environment, education, and health.
It
Those
feels
are
like
not
a
in terms of importance, by the way.
yeah.
Not in terms of
Of
importance, like, oh, if you have energy, we stop having education. And no, like they're all the same.
I mean, yes, mutually reinforcing, right? If families have more energy, they have the ability to create wealth for the families, to study, to
Right.
even be able to read books at night.
Yep.
So they're
Right.
all mutually reinforcing. I don't know. This feels like a no-brainer. Like, wouldn't it just be so simple to be like, hey guys, what we want to do is we want to put in, let's just say, $10 billion per year of debt spending through issuing government bonds, through public-private
Right.
partnerships. We guarantee the long-term financing. We do some government guarantees on the downside risk of these loans. There's a lot of multilateral institutions like both the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, they're both kind of like competing to expand credit. So I'm just kind of curious how, I don't know, it just feels like, for every island, you
Duh.
announce 3 projects, everybody's happy, markets are thumbs up.
Yeah.
Yeah. It'll take, 10 to 20 years to happen.
Well, Jeremy, I always say Indonesians' biggest enemy is usually ourselves. And when I say that, it's because unfortunately, when you're talking about the system, there's just so much rent-seeking behavior that happens. And it happens because of two reasons, right? One is short-term thinking. Let's be super real. It's happening in the US too. It happens everywhere. It's very short-term thinking, right? And you kind
Mm,
of can't,
yeah.
fault voters for that because voters are going to be as short term or as limited as whoever their leaders are. So if you're looking at the top of the leadership roster, there's a lot of short term thinking. There's a lot of thinking, how do I keep this position? How do I go up? Next, how do I make sure that I get paid in the however many years I serve? How do I maximize my access? So there's a lot of short term thinking, which breeds a lot of rent seeking behavior. Second of all, and this is also worrisome, a lot of people working in the civil service or working in public service in Indonesia actually have never worked in private sector ever before. Like they've never been in private. So there's often a clash between public and private where they both don't understand each other's point of view. Because I've been in both, and I can say that, as a public sector servant, sometimes you look at the private sector, and for you, that looks like such an incredible wealth. It's such a nice life. And you're thinking to yourself, why should I work a crazy amount of time making your life easier so that you can make more than me? And where do I stand here? You know? And it's very hard to really make other people see the other side unless you have better dialogues with each other. But right now, unfortunately, there's just so much clashing and so much short term thinking, which breeds rent seeking behavior from both sides. It's not that private sector is innocent in any way. No, but it's coming out in parties, right? And I think that is the problem. If we were to press pause for a minute and just go, hey, what should we do to nation build, which we've done before, right? 1998, there was a lot of work towards nation building. My dad was an economist at the time, was one of the people helping the nation building part. But then again, we were starting basically from scratch again. Hopefully, we've learned enough from history, which is why it's so important to always know some history so that you're just not repeating whatever it was before. Because the last thing this country needs is to go back to square one just in order to bring everybody down to zero and make everybody go, hey, oh shoot, we're here now. We're back down to zero. Maybe we should start working together. And I think that's a really big issue here. Lots of people not working together, lots of misunderstanding, lack of communication, lack of dialogue, and just constant assumptions about the other side, whatever the other side is, right? Public, private, pro this political party, pro that political party. And I think that in the end causes that much chaos over time. So you're right. Macros wise, we haven't really changed. Fundamentally speaking, we're actually still quite strong. But again, we need to just have more consistent and cooperative dialogue with each other, spanning the different factions and the different interests, and really sure that we're still in a nation building phase.
I think what's interesting is that, it's kind of like, has there been any harm? The answer is not yet, at least based on what you shared. I mean, obviously, the tricky part is just like the gains that were hoped for in terms of like, kind of like a mandate by the people to further improve the economy. Yeah, I don't think we've seen some changes. And I think it hasn't been in the direction that the markets were expecting fully, right? Like I said, I think if you look at it charitably, obviously there's a few ways we look at it, right? Like raising taxes on the mineral sector does improve government capabilities, then that should give them ability to spend more over time. But the question is, how would they spend it, right? And I think the head scratcher for me is feels like infrastructure feels like such a no-brainer that everybody complains about Indonesian infrastructure, right? So it just feels like, I don't know, we're doing so many moves.
It is a
but we're like,
no-brainer. You're
guys,
not.
the no-brainer move is not being done, and everyone's kind of like, we're not disagreeing that we should do all these things, like government efficiency. No one's really complains about that. Infrastructure spend. I don't know. To me, it just feels like the most obvious good move that's not done. So it's always like it's like a puzzling component to me, I guess. So I think there's a lot of moves that obviously can be seen as positive, which is about government efficiency. Obviously, I think it can be a good thing as well. Nothing wrong with that per se. It just feels like there's such an obvious good move, which is infrastructure development, which nobody feels is at the level it needs to be. And there's a lot of straightforward, good examples of it happening. I mean, we saw that in Japan, in Vietnam, in China. Everybody's racing to
Right.
build infrastructure. And obviously, there's a risk of overbuilding
Right.
infrastructure. It's just that nobody will ever argue
Yes.
that Indonesia has
Yes.
overbuilt its infrastructure at all, right?
No, no,
So I think there's a bit of a head
no.
scratcher.
Yeah, but again, infrastructure is a long-term play. And if players, especially at the top, have always been very short-term thinking and therefore having rent-seeking behavior infiltrate many parts of the system, yeah, it's going to be very hard to have a unified vision on infrastructure, right? So a really big homework that this country needs to keep doing is basically law reform, which is why lots of people until now have been so upset with the new revision to the military rule, which again, no one really knows the details, can only assume either the best or the worst, you know? And I think that's the thing. Like when we can do infrastructure spending, when we can do very no-brainer things, why is the government rushing for other types of changes, such as a revision to the military law? Like, is that a no-brainer? And I think that is a lot of this discontent happening right now, which is exactly what you're saying. Why aren't we doing the no-brainer type of projects? Why aren't we really building the economy? Why aren't we allowing people to open businesses and operate MSMEs efficiently? Why aren't we opening access to education, healthcare? Why aren't we fixing our air and our water? And these are just basic things, right? And why are we pursuing the short-term more political focus gains, such as military law or whatever law it is that people tend to pursue? I think that's a problem when you have a lot of short term thinking that it obscures the long term vision.
Ah, that's such a shame. I mean, it feels like, one of
Yeah.
those headlines where you could just imagine Indonesia-China strikes, infrastructure deal. Chinese company comes in and builds
Yeah.
everything for cheap and then using Chinese loans, it's like Belt and Road. For me, it just feels like, the headline is just waiting to happen, right? Which is like Indonesia and China strikes infrastructure deal. Prior success of high-speed rail has
Yes.
allowed,
I mean, we have a speed rail.
has made a decision that we're going to make 10 of these projects in different
Right.
islands, and we're going to use Chinese construction labor, Chinese
Right.
loans,
Yeah.
and we just had to guarantee, and then everyone's going to be like, yep, that works because the Chinese have been able to build infrastructure in Africa as well, where rent-seeking
Right.
behavior is also a concern. And the way they have solved it is
Right.
by, keeping it very tight, if that makes sense, within that ecosystem, which is
Absolutely. Yes.
obviously, I think, optically, it looks, sometimes it can look bad as like, this is just a Chinese thing. But on the other hand, they have been able to deliver on those projects as well.
Yeah. Look, we've had successes too, right? We've had the high-speed rails, we've built toll roads. It's not like we cannot build infrastructure. But you're right. I think one of the ways is to keep things tight, to make sure there are not too many players, like too many hands in the game, right? But I would say, every time people get so upset about Indonesia, I will say, like the leaders or the government or administration or whatever it is, you might be upset at them, but I'm actually extremely bullish, and I'm still bullish until today on Indonesian people. Because if we look at the people, I honestly don't know very many places where the people can still make a living, eke out small businesses, create products, do things despite all the challenging business environment and policies. I'll give them that, right? They're able to really create something out of basically nothing in a lot of ways. And I'm not talking the Nine Dragons or anything like that. I'm talking with my own eyes and seeing, like, in my own personal experience, meeting hundreds of these MSMEs just creating something, all the challenges, despite how hard it is, for example, to create an LLC. Right, in Indonesia, you need to invest so much for licenses, for random certifications that sometimes you don't realize you need because they just came up with the law yesterday. It takes you 1 to 2 years to create a trademark, which is crazy. So all of these challenges, and yet you still see small businesses growing. That's insane to me. So I think whenever people go, oh, how could you still stay there? Indonesia makes so many bad policies. Yeah, okay, so do a lot of other countries. It's not like the United States have been winning the game in making great economic policies these days, right? I mean, look at their S&P 500, like look at their markets right now. But I will say with Indonesia, I really have faith in the people, because not only can they still create a living, make the economy run, MSMEs are the lifeblood of this economy too, but also we are the type of people that can go against dictatorships. We can push back against things. We're known for it. Due to a viral online situation, we stopped the previous president's son from running for governor, right? So we can do things actually. It's just, again, for us, I always wonder if the government becomes more pro people and more pro businesses, how much can this country really grow?
I think that's a wonderful way to wrap up the conversation here is you're still bullish on the Indonesian people. And I think that's something that we have to continue working on. On that note, let's wrap things up. Thanks, Gita, for sharing your perspective.
No problem. Thank you for having this regular talk, and hopefully this can be one of those things that shed light onto why I actually really love Indonesia.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this episode, please share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. We would also appreciate you leaving a rating or review. Head over to www.bravesea.com for member content, resources, and community. Stay well and stay brave.